Alrighty, welcome everyone. So glad you were able to join us. So this is the third in the series of the Pennsylvania Bureau of Special Education and Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, the Memorandum of Understanding series, the rollout for the collaborative efforts between education, the Bureau of Special Education, and the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, or OVR, in the state of Pennsylvania. Today's topic is strategies for aligning efforts. Today's presenters are myself. I'm Michael Storr, and I work at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte for the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the Collaborative. And with me today is Melissa Deal, and Melissa works out of the George Washington University and is also with NTAC, the Collaborative. Also presenting today are Jackie Lister and Hillary Mangus from the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, or PATN, Caitlin Salvate from OVR, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, Everett Deibler, who works at the Lehigh Carbon Community College and has been a longtime member and board member of the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network, and Luz Hernandez and William Del Toro Vargas from the parent organization UNE. Today, we are going to start with this short overview, and then we're going to move into a discussion of flow of services and mapping of services for students, youth, and young adults with disabilities. Following that, we're going to have a review of the Pennsylvania Career Education and Work Standards, and then also looking at, from the OVR lens, pre-employment transition services, and then finally from IDA secondary transition, looking at post-secondary goals for further training, employment, and independent living. After that discussion, we're going to move into reviewing and discussing a document that was created for this MOU rollout, and it's a secondary transition crosswalk that looks at the components of general education around the career ed and work standards, pre-employment transition services, and then also looking at the IDA post-secondary transition requirements. We will then hear from youth and family members on their take on this crosswalk, why it would have been helpful to them to have when they were going through transition, and then some strategies for success. After that, we'll have a discussion from the folks from the PATN system and the OVR system about how and why this is important to professionals and how it can be used. And then we're going to wrap up with upcoming events and next steps. Hillary did put into the chat where you can find the handouts for today, and I'm just going to take you there real quickly. If you go to the PATN website, and you go under the training calendar for today and scroll down to today's date, which is May 13th, you will find the information about today's webinar, but you also will see in the event files, there are 4 handouts for today. So there's the PowerPoint, there is a pre-employment services mapping worksheet that aligns kind of that mapping of the 5 required pre-employment transition services to education areas. And then there is the OVR Pre-EDS Continuum. That's a new document that the folks at OVR have updated. And then lastly is this crosswalk document that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So we just showed you kind of where you can find the materials for today. Just a note that today's session is also being recorded. And we did want to let folks know, if you have any questions, please put those into the Q&A box. We also are going to have some chat questions throughout the day. So you'd be using the Q&A and the chat features. And with the questions in the chat, we will be collecting those as we have in the last several sessions. And we're looking at those for our future work that we're doing in the state. So we're going to get started with a poll question just to see who is with us today. So just give me 1 second and we will launch that. So let us know who's out there. Please go ahead and type in who is with us this morning. And we'll give you folks a couple more seconds to do that. And again, thank you all for joining us. We really do appreciate that. And we'll give you just a little bit more. We'll usually wait about a minute till everybody has a chance to punch in. Okay, great. So just to kind of let folks know who is with us. So we do have a large representation from OVR, Office of Vocational Rehabilitation staff, and then education staff. But we also welcome our other community rehab providers, our other agency staff, as well as our family members and other stakeholders that are joining us. So again, thank you for taking time in your busy schedules to be with us today. So I wanted to just mention, and those of you that may be tuning in to today's webinar for the first one, and you missed the last two, that all of the information and the webinars in this series can be found on the Patten website. So if you go to the link that's in the slide, you'll be taken to this page on the Patten website. This page is related specifically to the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation and the linkages between OVR and the education system. So what you'll find on this page is we do have the information regarding this webinar series, and then you will also be able to find the two sessions that we have already done in this series. So the one on April 8th that goes into detail about the MOU, and it also includes a copy of the MOU. And then you will find the session that we did on April 21st on engaging stakeholders, along with all of the handouts that went along with that session. After today, as I mentioned, this session is being recorded, and that recording will be posted here along with these handouts. I also wanted to mention to you, however, that there are other webinars from the past that are posted that are directly related to OVR, and then the linkages to OVR and education. So please be sure to check those out also, and you can find those on this site. So again, you can find those by going to the link. The other thing that we wanted to mention, and there have been a lot of questions and comments, I think, over the last two webinars that, you know, it's been a continual struggle in Pennsylvania for consistency with services for students in secondary transition and the collaboration that's occurring with education, OVR, as well as the other agencies in the state, the IDDD system, the mental health, behavioral health system, and community rehab providers. And oftentimes that's a successful partnership and things are going well, but occasionally that's not always successful. And I think just to put out there that that's something that is recognized and really is at the heart of why this work is occurring, you know, really to strive to get to more of a seamless transition. We used to think about, in years ago, and I go back to like the mid 90s in secondary transition, that we thought of secondary transition as a relay race, where students, as they got ready to graduate, we were passing a baton to the agencies like OVR, IDDD system, mental health system, to then pass that work on in supporting that youth, young adult with disabilities. I think what we're talking about with this webinar series, and really where the field of transition has moved, is thinking of it more like a sack race that you might have at a county fair, where we are together in this race, we're side by side, and we're supporting those young folks in high school, and then as they move on to transition to adult life. So again, just making those comments, know that the other resources in this series are on the Patten website. Whoops. So we're going to next move into and talk in this next section about resource mapping and interagency flow of services. And really what this gets at, and this is being done and it can be done at the state level, but I think really where we're focusing on today is to look at this at the local level in your local areas and your collaborations that are occurring within a school district with your VR counselor that's been assigned or is working with your district, as well as your other agency stakeholders, and then engaging your families and youth. So it's really identifying and providing the what, where, when, and for whom. And in thinking about this, it's really thinking about, is everybody clear about who's doing what? And I think in particularly, focusing on competitive integrated employment for students and youth with disabilities. Are we setting goals that build on the strengths that these services provide? And are we able to identify any gaps in services? So that what we are providing is not being supplanted, but supplementing or supporting the services that education, OVR, and the other agencies provide. And then really looking at how are we keeping track and what is the data sources that we are using to measure progress. I wanted to highlight two resources regarding resource mapping and interagency flow of services. The first is a guide that was put together by NTAC, and it's a resource mapping and flow of services document. I would recommend, clicking on this link or going to the NTAC collaborative website, transitionta.org, to find this. There's really good information. It talks about, why it's important to look at flow of services and resource mapping, how it's implemented, the implications for practice and how it evolves at a system and a student level. It also talks about some difficulties you might have in this process, and then it lists some resources. So again, would recommend looking at that. The other set of documents I wanted to refer folks to, and this actually comes from Orange County, California, outside, it's Los Angeles. In the state of California, about 4 or 5 years ago, put together a blueprint for secondary transition across the state, which was an interagency model. I wanted to highlight this particular group though, in Orange County, because they have really good interagency linked documents. And I just want to mention one of the series, but what that link will do will take you to their Google Drive that has all of these contained. But they have really, as I was mentioning, a really nice set of interagency collaborative processes that can be done at the local level. So for example, they have a universal referral tool that is at the student level, and it looks at all of the partners and then how they are engaged with that young person. So it's just one example of their many resources that they have on that site of kind of this cross collaboration that can be done. I think in the state of Pennsylvania, even looking at our local transition coordinating councils and maybe looking at that. And is there a way to replicate some of this work? I think it should also be mentioned that each area in Pennsylvania is very different. From the larger cities of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Erie, the Allentown area, to the really small areas and counties throughout the state, how you are actually engaging is different. But I think it's really important that what we're looking at is how we can collaborate for successful transition, given the resources, given the locality, given the competitive employment options in our areas. So resource mapping. It's basically this system or method that looks at linking community resources, and it's agreeing upon a vision, goals, and strategies. And when you refer back to the Orange County site and that Google Drive that I showed you, they talk about their vision, and they talk about how, as this interagency collaborative, very similar to a local coordinating transition council in our state in Pennsylvania, how to build those relationships and align systems. So why is it important to map? And it's, I think, first of all, to define what it is exactly we're looking at. So I think for the purposes of this group and in thinking about the students and youth that we're working with, and especially with our partnerships with the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, OVR, and Education, it's really looking at competitive integrated employment. So in looking at that, it's then a step back to see how there can be a systematic coordination approach to facilitating that work. It's identifying what's happening. It's linking to those businesses and those new resources. It's determining what exists and what doesn't and who's doing what. And I know those of you that have been doing this for a while, and I've been involved in this work for about 30 years, we've done this, right? I mean, those of us that were doing this work in the late 80s and 90s. So it's not necessarily something new, but I think it's taking a step back and seeing where we are locally, looking at what our partnerships are doing and how that's occurring. Along with resource mapping, some of the processes, and we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Melissa Deal is going to be talking about this, but it's identifying gaps, looking at overlaps and duplications of programs and services. It's also then looking at, from your local community, what exists, and then possibly what needs to be created, or how could things be looked at different, reallocate it, possibly braid it or blend it. It's also then looking at developing new partnerships. And I know it sometimes becomes trite saying, well, who's not at the table? But it truly is looking at who do we need to draw in? And again, it's going to look different depending on where in Pennsylvania you're located. And then it's also looking at what data we're collecting and how we're documenting what it is that we're doing. So in this next piece, we're going to talk about the steps to resource mapping. So first, defining the goal, the vision. Then looking at the resources that exist, looking at the overlaps and gaps, and then actually implementing it. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Melissa Deal.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. And we're just going to break it down a little bit further, what Michael was talking about, and kind of look at what this looks like, and kind of break it down into steps. And one of the things that I think, as Michael was sharing, we know that for many of you, this isn't new, but there's been a few things that have probably taken precedence in your work life or home life recently, with the pandemic or new legislation. And sometimes it's hard to prioritize things like this when we get to our day-to-day tasks and the piles start creeping up. So part of the emphasis on this work is just to kind of bring that back in the forefront, because we really do know that when we do this, it makes the transition work better, and it makes your life better because you're not carrying everything yourself, and you're using your partners and your resources and your community to help support the students that we all aim to work with and see succeed. So in step one, we're just taking a look at who is at the table, right? So, how do we really get a good representation from our communities of a good cross-section of stakeholders and organizations to bring to the table to support our students? How do we invite those folks, and who do we want to be at the table that has those ties within our local districts or areas? And then selecting those folks who can help us create additional linkages between our systems, whether that's the school districts or vocational rehabilitation, our families, the DD agencies, other networks, and just thinking about not just what you need, but why should the others care that you're there? Or what are you going to share that you're going to bring to the table, that they're going to see the connection to their own work, so that we do continue those linkages. So, one partner that often gets left out of the table, but is a important part of the work, is our Title I youth programs. So just thinking about maybe who traditionally we haven't maybe thought about, but is an important partner for the work. Okay, Michael. And this is just an example of, kind of mapping out those partnerships. So after we identify who those potential partners are going to be, we want to think about why they might be there. What's their vested interest? What's their primary mission and objectives? And then what do they bring to the table in terms of resources and service delivery? And what's maybe unique about each entity? And what do they have in common? And then what are we going to map out in terms of how to get them to be involved and what they can bring to the table? So how are we going to engage them? And why would they want to be there beyond that mission-driven orientation? But what are they going to see in this group, in this cross-section interagency work, that they're going to see that connection and that linkage for the work? Okay, Michael. All right, and then in terms of mapping employment resources, we want to just drill down a little further and look at, a work experience continuum. We're going to show you an example in a minute, but, what does this look like in the local areas? What's available? How are we going to collect the data on these employment resources? So that's whether that's doing that in a meeting, using surveys, whether, we're going to interview folks. How are we going to gather that information? And then how are we going to sustain it so that it's not going to be static information? Okay, Michael. Our next slide is going to be an example of the work experience continuum. And so this example is a grade level example, and it's not to kind of say this only happens in 9th grade or this only happens in 10th grade, but just some examples of some age appropriate types of services. So in this example, we're using work experiences. So in 9th grade, it might be job shadowing and career planning or participating in workplace tours. And then if we jump to the 11th grade, we're kind of kicking it up a little bit. Maybe they're participating in some job clubs or job shadowing or service learning or paid employment experiences. So again, we're going from that awareness phase at the earliest end or the left side of that continuum through exploration, preparation, and then ultimately to employment. All right, Michael. And this is another example of a mapping tool where we're going to go ahead and scan these employment resources. So if we look at vocational rehabilitation, our career and tech ed programs, and our local schools, then we're going to kind of map out, okay, what are some examples in our local area that is available under each of these resources? So what does that look like in terms of, do they offer job shadowing? Do they have unpaid experiences, internships, paid work? What types of worksite tours, things like that. So we can kind of, again, begin to drill down and see what's available, which is going to bring us to our next piece of it, where we're going to be able to then see what's here and what's not, right? And I wanted to just mention that a lot of these examples that we're throwing up on the slides, we have in the previous round of NTACT, the collaborative, and WinTAC, we had combined to develop a guide for collaboration with VR in education. And there's an appendix to that guide, and it's available on both of those websites, that has a lot of these tools that you can pull down and modify and use to however it makes sense for you in your local area. So this example here is just looking at businesses. So again, same principle as we had with the resources, agency resources, but now we're going to look at businesses, and we're going to map out, what are they offering? Do they provide company tours? We've seen some really cool examples recently with the pandemic where VR is collaborating with employers to develop virtual worksite tours. We have businesses providing really cool virtual tours all through their work site, and kind of helping students understand what it's like to work in the company and what types of techniques and skills and training and what they offer in the company. So just wanted to mention that, but could be informational interviews, job shadows, unpaid and paid work experiences. So again, we're just mapping out who the business is, what they do, and then what those contacts are. So again, another way to map out those businesses and take a good scan of what's in our communities. That brings us to looking at then, okay, we've done this mapping, what is it telling us, right? So what's here and where are the gaps? And how do we identify and ensure that we're not duplicating, but we're leveraging the work, so that if there is duplication, when are we going to take the lead role and when are we going to take the supporting role? And that's where bringing everyone to the table and having that cross-agency work group is so important, so that you can work those things out and map those things out and provide the services as a lead or a supporting actor when it makes the most sense. We're going to again look at those gaps. And then when we identify those gaps, we can go back to that first step where we were looking at who's coming to the table and what they bring, and see, is there someone at the table who can do that work but currently isn't? And could we work with them to provide that service? Or is there somebody missing from the table that we could identify? And how can we leverage our partners on the work group to help identify how to fill that gap? So some of the examples we had were for some of our targeted population, like those who might be in the juvenile justice system, homeless, or those individuals with the most significant disabilities. Okay. So that'll bring us to our next step, where we're going to actually look at implementation, right? And from all this work, we're going to develop an action plan and look at how are we going to address those gaps? What did we identify? What is the structure of the work we're going to do? And again, getting back to what Michael was talking about, the ultimate goal is truly to support our students, but also to work smarter. We're not trying to make the work harder and more cumbersome, but how can we be flexible and adapt and work and co-construct this work with our partners and our communities and ultimately our students and families? And then how are we going to disseminate and communicate the information across each other to ensure that we're sharing the information and that the students getting what they need? And then this slide is a great example, I think, of, just kind of looking again at a mapping of, in this example, we have the 5 pre-employment transition services. And this is done at the grade level example. And on the top of the bar, we see what maybe be provided by the LEA, and then what services could be provided by the vocational rehabilitation services, whether that was done directly by VR counselors or through one of their providers. So you can kind of see under work-based learning at the 8th to 9th grade level, the LEA might be looking at informational interviews and school-based programs and things like that. And on the VR side, they might be looking at career tours with the students and doing some online career exploration. So again, just a way to kind of leverage what's already available, and then map that across so that we can ensure there's robust services for our students.
So thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that. And it was really, I think the point in the tie-in to the crosswalk that we're talking about today is really identifying what currently exists, what each of us are doing, each of us being education, the LEA level, the school district level, the OVR folks, as well as our agency partners. So really seeing what resources exist. The other piece that we want to talk about, in addition to resources, is looking at how services, how that young adult, that student, youth with a disability engages, right? And what is offered to that student to be successful as they transition to adulthood. So it's really looking again at this collaborative process and looking at that local system level, how does a student receive services and supports and how are they connected? It's identifying those roles and who is responsible, how families are engaged and how that young person is engaged and how those connections are made. And then it's providing this cross-agency planning and communication. And again, like Melissa was talking about, it's identifying what currently exists, what opportunities are there, if there are any gaps, and what that duplication looks like. I think it's also important to note that when we look at the regulations for our various organizations, there is the requirement, and we've talked about this in past webinars, of education and engaging outside agencies as part of the secondary transition process starting at age 14. But also from the OBR lens, especially when we're looking at pre-employment transition services for potentially eligible students or transition services for eligible students, it's also engaging with these partners. So this is a slide, a chart that's really just looking at how to look at flow of services. And again, similar to the other charts that we have shown, there's an age range starting at age 13 all the way through age 1924, where you're kind of looking at, prior to traditionally the secondary transition process in education, and then a follow-up of a couple years as that individual would graduate from high school. What are those student outcomes? What agencies is that student connected to? And then looking at the roles and responsibilities of targeted agencies. And we just have a couple listed here, right? So we just have VR, OVR, education system, career tech ed, families. That list is not complete, right? We'd add other columns there to other agencies that would be supporting that individual student. And I guess one of the things to mention here is this is an individualized process. So it really would depend upon that young person, their disability, their needs, their post-secondary goals, right? So both what would be listed in that student's IEP as well as IPE. So when we look at flow of services at an individual student level, it really is designed to provide a roadmap for both the IEP and IPE development. It helps to increase the understanding of not only the families, but also the youth and what supports and services are available across the years, and helps to explain that connection between them. And it helps the student in sharing information during planning meetings. It also helps in that coordination of their goals. So this slide's looking at the flow of services at an individual student level. And it's that same slide. The difference is we have some things filled in here, right? So it's looking at, the student outcome areas, their expectations that they're engaged with, how they're connected to different agencies, and then the role that education in VR is taking for that individual student. So with that, going to now turn this over to Hillary to talk a little bit about the career education and work standards.
Thanks, Michael. So when we start to think about what are we comparing, where are we looking for those gaps, one of the most important places to start is what's happening in the general education setting. And so for our students with and without disabilities, all students should be having access to the career education and work standards. And because everybody on this call you saw from the initial poll, we have a wide range of people participating in today's call. That wide range of participants may have differing levels of understanding about the different resources and programs and regulations that govern transition programming. But at the foundation within the general education setting, we have the career education work standards, which come from Chapter 4 of Title 22. And those really are the State Board of Education's regulations for all students in Pennsylvania to be exposed to opportunities to prepare them for post-secondary life. So the career education and work standards really are an outline for what students should know and be able to do at grades 3, 5, 8, and 11 in the areas of career awareness and preparation, career acquisition, career retention and advancement, and entrepreneurship. And so a little bit about each of these. Career awareness and preparation can really be thought of what are we doing to prepare students to learn about jobs and to start to know their strengths, talents, abilities, and interests and how they apply to acquiring certain jobs. These things tend to focus on helping students identify their abilities and interests, while also looking at things like non-traditional workplace roles and what are the local opportunities for employment, as well as forces for influencing careers and what preparation is needed in order to pursue that career. Career acquisition really can be thought of as the skills needed to get a job. So things like interviewing skills, completing the necessary paperwork, like a job application, creating your resume, all of the different things that a person does in order to acquire a job. Then we think of career retention and advancement along the lines of what am I doing to keep my job once I have it? So, what are those soft skills, work habits, things like working on a team, group dynamics, learning skills like budgeting and time management in order to help a person keep a job once they've acquired the job? And then finally, entrepreneurship are those things that students will learn about the risks and rewards of starting a business, and then what are the tools and resources that they need to start a business on their own, such as a business plan. Next slide. So this slide really is an outline of all of the different substandards within the 4 standard areas. So you can just get a sense as to what is addressed in each of those areas. And again, these are standards that are addressed with benchmark points at grades 3, 5, 8, and 11. So thinking about how implementation of the career education and work standards happens. So Pennsylvania Chapter 339 established the development of and implementation of a comprehensive K-12 school counseling plan that included services that are aligned to the career education and work standards. And what that really calls for is the integration of the career education and work standards across a variety of K-12 courses. What's great is that in order to ensure that Pennsylvania students were on track for meaningful post-secondary engagement, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, Pennsylvania included a measure of career readiness through the Future Ready PA Index called the Career Readiness Indicator, which is essentially the implementation of the career education and work standards and puts forth some requirements for documenting and providing evidence that students are having experiences across the 4 career education and work standard areas. So under the Every Student Succeeds Act, one of the requirements is the development of a student portfolio. And again, this is for all students. So at grades 5, 8, and 11 under ESSA, the student portfolio has to have certain benchmark evidence that the student has engaged in career education and work standard activities. This evidence is cumulative and must be individualized according to a student's needs and interests. And again, this is starting well before Chapter 14's requirements for starting transition planning at least at age 14. So we're thinking about this in a great way because this really is starting transition planning before age 14 for all students. So how does the portfolio grow? So in grade 5, the student portfolio has to have 6 pieces of evidence that are collected across grades kindergarten through 5th grade. Then in 8th grade, you have that portfolio that has the original 6 artifacts from kindergarten through 5th grade, but then an additional 6 items collected in grades 6 through 8 are included in the portfolio. So we've now moved to 12 pieces of evidence by grade 8. In addition, what's unique is that during the grade 8 year, the student has to show evidence towards the creation of an individual career plan, and we'll talk a little bit about what the career plan is compared to the portfolio. Then in grade 11, we have all of that K to 8 evidence, so those 12 pieces that have already been there. But then in addition, we're collecting an additional 8 items, and the student has to have demonstrated evidence of implementation of their individual career plan. So the goal really for the individual career plan is to help students identify the things that they need to achieve their post-school outcomes. It's required for every student, and it must be aligned to the career education and work standards, but the plan is really the kind of the who, what, where, why, when, and how of that type of learning for the students. So what courses do they need to take? What experiences should they be having? Who's going to help them get there? Why are these the appropriate courses? And then what other things might they need along that journey as well? And where are those experiences going to occur? So what does this mean then for students with disabilities. So again, I kind of alluded to this earlier. The great part about this is when the student turns 14, this shouldn't be the first piece of information that we shouldn't be starting with a blank slate. We should really be coming to the table now with the items in their career portfolio, and what they're starting to build for their individual career plan to help guide the present levels and the creation of transition goals, services, and activities. It's also important to know that the IEP does not replace the requirement for any student's portfolio or plan under Every Student Succeeds Act. They should be complementing each other, informing each other, but the IEP transition plan does not replace the requirements to collect the portfolio requirements and the individual career plan. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague from OVR, Caitlin Salvati, and she's going to talk a little bit about another consideration for us, the pre-employment transition service areas.
Thanks, Hillary. So yeah, continuing to talk about what services can be provided to these students, we're going to talk about OVR's pre-employment transition services. This is going to be, again, just a quick overview. So if you are familiar with these services, I apologize that you are going to have to hear me say this again. But we are then going to tie all of this together. So again, our pre-employment transition services are all about helping students with disabilities learn about themselves, understand work requirements, practice those work skills, choose a career, and explore training options. These services are really intended to provide a generalized early start to job exploration, and that's really how they differ from our vocational rehabilitation services for students that have an open case with OVR. Those are very specific and focused on a job goal, whereas our pre-employment transition services, again, are generalized, typically done in a group setting, and really all about just that early introduction to job exploration. Next slide. For a student to be able to participate in our pre-employment transition services, they have to be between the ages of 14 and 21 through 21. They have to be enrolled in secondary or post-secondary education. So they have to be in high school or some sort of post-secondary education setting. They have to have an IEP, a 504 plan, or self-identify themselves as a student with a disability. And they may or may not have an open case with OVR. For a good portion of our pre-employment transition services, a student does not have to have an open case with OVR. For some of them, they might then have to look to open a case or at least have an application in, but it is not a requirement for a good portion of our pre-employment transition services. Going over, the umbrella look here at pre-employment transition services, there are three categories to pre-ETS. There is required, authorized, and coordination. Required is probably what we are all most familiar with, as it's those 5 required services that have to be provided directly to students. And we're going to go more into those in our next slides. There's also authorized. This includes activities for outreach and training on pre-ETS topics to parents, staff, and other professionals. And then lastly, we have coordination, which is additional student services that support the provision of our required pre-employment transition services. And that's where our IEP meetings fall under. All right, so we're going to then take a little bit closer look at our required services. There are 5 required pre-ETS. Those are self-advocacy instruction, counseling on post-secondary options, job exploration counseling, work-based learning, and workplace readiness training. And then on my next slide, I actually have those defined a little bit more so we know what's expected in each of those services. Self-advocacy instruction is really about helping students with disabilities build skills to solve problems and communicate their needs and interests. Counseling on post-secondary options helps students with disabilities decide if college or training after high school is right for them. Job exploration counseling helps students with disabilities learn about jobs and pick a career. Work-based learning experiences is all about using community workplaces to provide students with disabilities the knowledge and skills that will help them connect school experiences to real-life work activities and hopefully future career opportunities. So that service is really all about our paid work experiences, our job shadowing, going out into the community. And then lastly, we have workplace readiness training, which teaches students with disabilities how to get and keep a job. So before I turn it over, I did want to quickly bring up our pre-ETS continuum, if we have that, Michael. This continuum is again on the Patten website with the rest of today's handouts. So thanks, Michael. So on our continuum, again, this has been updated recently by OVR. So you may have seen a version of this before, but the updated version is on the Patten website. The continuum consists of 3 columns that we have broken our required pre-employment transition services into, and it reads from left to right. So in our left column, we start with career exploration and preparation. And that's all about letting a student gain those introductory skills and enter workplaces for short periods of time. So this is kind of where we're starting with our pre-employment transition services. And if you go down and look under each of the categories of our 5 required services, you'll see some examples of what services could happen for a student at that time. Our middle column is career engagement, so kind of a next step up in pre-employment transition services. And that's about increasing a student's knowledge of jobs while gaining employability skills and some entry-level skills. And then again, there's some examples of what required services could happen at that stage. And then lastly, we have career experience and planning. And that's allowing the student to gain specific skills and experience in an occupation of interest. So again, we then have some examples of what services could happen at that stage. Just a warning that since those services are really getting a little bit more individualized to the student, some of those services may require an open case at that point too. So that's on the first page, that continuum of pre-employment transition services. On the second page is then, again, just an overview of pre-employment transition services, that definition, defining the 5 required services again. And then at the very bottom is another mini continuum of how a student can move from pre-employment transition services to our VR services and what that might look like and the steps the student needs to take. There it is. Thanks, Michael. So again, feel free to pull that from the Patten website, print it out and use it as you need it. And that wraps it up for me. I believe it's to Jackie now.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different for a minute. Just to reintroduce myself, Jackie Lister, and I'm work alongside Hillary Mangus in the Patten system, talking about secondary transition for a long time as part of the work that I do. And it really is at the heart, I think, of what education is all about. It is where things sort of end up for students, and all the hard work everybody does, we get to see that then. So have up here that I want you to think about your dream vacation. And whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and enter that into the chat. So take a look at that, everybody. You might get some good ideas. I see Tanzania, Key West, lots of beaches, but there's Switzerland, Alaska, Bora Bora, Italy, Ireland, planning a trip there myself, Disney, Jamaica, a quiet mountain, Vermont and Belize, Kilimanjaro. So you're getting the idea that with people, we've got close to 500 people on this call today. You're getting the idea that everybody's got a little bit different plans. Some of them are very specific. Some of them talk about one particular town on a particular island, or some of them talk about a larger destination like a beach or Ireland and Scotland. When we think about planning for a vacation, each destination requires us to think about how we're going to plan that. So do I need a beach chair and a book? Or do I need a set of skis to take with me? Do I need warm clothes? Do I need just a bathing suit and towel? So when we think about planning a vacation, that destination has to be in mind before we can ever think about planning for how to get there. And just like our vacation planning, sometimes we need to make alternate plans. Sometimes there's shifts along the way. We might have decided to do something and COVID comes along. And so I have to, instead of going to my favorite beach vacation, I have to take a trip to Puerto Vallarta, which is what I had to do last year during the summer instead of my beach vacation. But I still got that in mind. So, as we think about this and we move forward, we think about transition planning, all that you've heard around systems planning and including what services OVR is offering at the school age, thinking about what's happening in your school systems, being able to put them all together with systems planning. We're just going to dip our toes back into what does IDEA say about that, so we can make sure that you're seeing IDEA connected to the big picture. Because I think sometimes what happens when we think about our IEP planning, we forget about all of this other planning that goes in as part of it, these systems plans that build into supporting that individual plan for secondary transition that we think about for each of our students moving forward from age 14 on. So in our next slide is a definition of IDEA. Last time we talked about, that bigger definition of IDEA and what that means when it comes to secondary transition, that impact that it has. Well, here is that legal definition of secondary transition taken from IDEA 2004. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into those post-secondary goals, but we look at it as a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that is designed within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability, to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing and adult education, adult services, independent living, and community participation. So sometimes we only think about those 3 post-secondary goals: education, employment, independent living, and we forget about the rest of this definition. And everything you've heard up until this point from Michael and Melissa, from Hillary and from Caitlin, when you look at all those systems coming together, they really do fit nicely within this definition of IDEA. So we have to remember that big picture planning supports this individual planning. On the next slide, we're going to take a look just step by step at transition services. So first we look at assessments. When we look at that, we think about assessment and age appropriate assessment, meaning that that's something that's done every year that identifies needs, strengths, preferences, and interests. So first we look at those preferences and interests and we think about, well, where do I want to go? Just like I didn't ask any of you how you were going to get to Hawaii or how you were going to get to Bora Bora, or do you have the money, or do you have the planning skills to get there? I didn't ask you that first. I said, where do you want to go? And that's your goal. Based on that assessment, that is your goal. Those are your preferences and interests of where you want to go. So first we do that and we set those post-secondary goals. While we're doing that, we take a look at, well, what strengths do I bring to this? What planning skills do I have? What do I have to bring that's part of what I already know and can support those post-secondary goals? Those are my strengths. And finally, then we take a look at needs. And we're like, okay, so if this is the goal and this is where we want to go, then what are the things we need to do? What skills do we need to build in order to get you there? That's all based in assessment. And when we write those post-secondary goals in education, employment, and independent living, we're looking at all 3 of those. What is it that I want to do in all 3 of those areas? And individually, what do I want to do? I don't just take a look at, well, I'm a person maybe with complex support needs, so I'm not going to work. We don't just automatically assume that. We really automatically assume that you are going to work. And then we take a look at what are the supports you might need in order to get you there. So as we're writing those measurable post-secondary goals, we're getting your dreams on the page, ready to move forward. Then we say, what services and activities are needed in order to support you to move closer to that post-secondary goal? What instruction are you going to need? And that takes place, we see, look at the course of study. We say, if you want to learn to take care of your own car, then maybe that's something, a course that you want to be a part of. Or if you want to be able to cook your own meals, maybe that's a course that you want to take. If you're looking at engineering as something that you want to do in the future, and this is your goal, is to work in the field of engineering, then we need to make sure that you have advanced math and science as part of your coursework. So that instruction piece. And then are there related services that you need in order to be able to better support the skill development that you need to get you closer to those post-secondary goals that you have in mind? What community experiences are you going to need? Do you need to have that experience of working in a competitive paid work experience before you leave? Well, research says, yeah, you do, but that is the best thing for you to be able to have some type of competitive paid work experience while you're in school in order for you to have success when you're leaving. So that's a part of your community experience, but it also might be travel training, learning to get from place to place and figuring out using Google Maps to figure out, how do I get from here to there? How far is it really for me to go from this job to this job, or to move from, if I have to get to the barber shop from my job, how do I do that? And then all those skills of daily living as well, taking care of myself in whatever way I'm capable or able to do at the highest level possible for me. What are the skills, activities, and services that I need in order to be able to build those skills? That course of study we kind of talked about. In order to build those skills, what are we going to need in order to be able to do that? And then are there agencies that we need to coordinate with? Michael and Melissa talked about mapping those agencies and thinking about how within my own LEA, within my own school system, and then beyond that within my community, what are the agencies and services that are available to support students within that school? So if you're doing that mapping, then you're able to answer these questions a little bit easier, so that we think about that as a process supporting what's happening in IDEA, what's happening in the IEP process. So we look at what are those agencies that can support you while you're in school, but then we're also connecting you with agencies that will better support you when you're ready to move into the adult world. And then finally, we're writing annual IEP goals. As we write those annual IEP goals, we're taking a snapshot of how we doing along in this process. How are we doing with building skills that better support the success that you're looking for in those 3 post-secondary goals? And then finally, at the end of the IEP year, we'll take a look and we'll go back in and do more assessment and say, well, how do we do this year? Did we move forward? Are we looking better? Are we moving towards those post-secondary goals? Now what else? What's important for this IEP year to be able to help you move closer to those post-secondary goals? And that gives us a better connection now between what's happening, what we've been talking about in this MOU process, and how it better supports what we're doing as part of IDEA. This is an annual process. So every year we're re-looking at that. Is it okay for my post-secondary goals to change from the time I'm in 9th grade to the time I'm in 10th grade? Absolutely. Just like my travel goal had to change because things were a little different this year. So I had to look at my travel goal a little bit differently. I may change my mind and decide I no longer like these very, very warm temperatures and sitting on the beach. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could. And I might decide that I need to go somewhere cooler. But as we think about this, these post-secondary goals can change at any time. We look at them annually, and there should be evidence that we're updating them annually. They should be very individualized for that student, and we should do everything we can to get the best assessment possible, regardless of where that student is on the spectrum of their support needs. All right, and then in the next slide, just a brief look again at all 3 post-secondary goals. When we think about a post-secondary goal, they give us direction. We cannot plan without them. Without post-secondary goals being defined ahead of time in the IEP process, just like that dream vacation, one really has to have a place to go in order to figure out how to get there. We should know that these post-secondary goals are something that are happening in the future after graduation. And that is a mistake. Sometimes we see that people are looking at post-secondary goals as being something that happens during the school year, but this is, as we look at post-secondary goals, these are goals that are happening after graduation. All right. I think I'm passing this on.
Yeah, no, actually, you're hanging in there, Jackie. So, next up, we are going to move and talk a little bit about the document that was developed by the MOU work group. This is the secondary transition crosswalk document. So Caitlin and Hillary and Jackie are going to kind of join in and go over this particular resource document with y'all. Really wanted to put out there, though, what were the career and work standards, the pre-employment transition services and requirements under WIOA, and then looking at what Jackie just got done discussing, the requirements of IDEA. It's interesting because I saw a couple comments in there in the question and answer in the chat box about a couple of individuals saying, well, in our local area, we do all this stuff. What's new with the MOU? And I guess the thing is, the MOU itself is just emphasizing what y'all should be doing. And there have been no new legislative mandates. What the MOU is doing and what this webinar series and the process is re-emphasizing the fact that this should be a collaboration. These are the things that you all should be doing. And if you are lucky enough to be in a place that's got this figured out and are working collaboratively, you know, kudos. But we know that across the state of Pennsylvania, and actually in all the states that I know Melissa and I work in, there are pockets where things are amazing and there's things going on, but then there are also areas that are still working on this and they're still trying to have this become a really good process. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Hillary and Caitlin and Jackie.
Excuse me, sorry, I was sneezing. So one of the things that I really like about this document is it starts out with the understanding that there are ways to walk through the idea of supplementing and not supplanting services. And I know that's the biggest part of it. So we've talked a little bit about the three different pieces that kind of fit into this puzzle, right? So the things that are happening in regular education, which is going to look different, right? How that's happening, what types of activities are being done at an LEA level is going to look different from LEA to LEA. The standards are the standards, but what and how it's being implemented and where it's being implemented is going to look different from LEA to LEA. Same thing with pre-employment transition services. There's information we've shared with you about that. And then bridging it together is what are those things that are happening under IDEA for a student that aren't maybe things that are happening in the regular education setting or are not happening through pre-employment transition services. And that's where you really start that mapping and the flow of services to find out what things aren't we doing and who can help to provide those experiences for our students. So a couple of the considerations when you're thinking about supplementing and not supplanting is the purpose of the service, right? So if it's something that you're doing related to an educational goal or an educational service outcome, it's IDEA or the Career Education and Work Standards under ESSA. If it's not and it's an employment specific goal that isn't being done through your LEA or through the IEP, OVR can help with that, right? And then customary services. So we talk a little bit about the customary things that we're providing in the general education setting or under Part B of IDEA. If those are things that we're doing, we don't need OVR to do those at our local level, but they could be doing other things. And that's where this whole idea of mapping what's happening, finding the holes, finding those gaps, and then bringing in additional services that are going to be meaningful and relevant experiences for students. And then eligibility. And so these three areas are addressed kind of at the onset of this crosswalk to really help think about making the determination about who's providing what and where do you find this information. And where you find it is what happens on the next couple pages, which is what are the connections and overlaps between the three pieces. So from a career ed work standard lens, I mentioned grades 3, 5, 8, and 11. We use the 11th grade standards for the purposes of this document. After I'm done talking, I will also post a link to where you can access the standards for grades 3, 5, and 8. And then I'm going to let Caitlin and Jackie talk a little bit about how this overlaps with pre-employment transition services and IDEA on the document.
Thanks, Hillary. Yeah, I really did. I mean, you did a great job introducing that. And I really did want to also reinforce, we're always having that conversation about supplementing and not supplanting, and that there really is no black and white list as far as these are the services that the school offers to these students at this age, and then this is the list that of pre-employment transition services that OVR does. It really is going to depend on the student and the school, and what can be provided and what the student has already received and what they need. And again, you said, like, is the intention of the service an education goal or is it an employment goal? So we can't, unfortunately, give you just that straightforward list of services. But so this was our attempt at helping, to answer, those questions around supplanting. So as Hillary had said, we broke it down by the career and education work standards, which are on the very left column. And then in the middle column, we pulled out a list of our 5 required pre-employment transition services, and then examples under each of those 5 categories of appropriate services that could happen to match that career and education work standard. So as you would scroll through the document, you would see each standard broken down and then the correlating pre-employment transition services, and then IDEA on our very right column. Go ahead, Jackie. Sorry.
So I think, part of what we hear from LEAs is that this is confusing. And you're right, it is a little confusing because it is very local. When you think about a school district that might be in the suburbs of Philadelphia, that is affluent and has a lot of transportation access and has a ton of businesses that might support work for students and opportunities that might be there for students to do some work and some employment experiences while they're in high school. So some competitive integrated experiences, but also just some maybe job coaching experiences. And their environment is very rich with experiences to be able to do that at the LEA level. And then you have some areas where that is not the case and there are not a lot of opportunities. And so the district might need help with that, and LEA might need help with that. So when we see that, that's why, as Caitlin said, we can't just say, this is what's available from OVR, and this is exactly what schools should be doing. Schools should be doing everything they can to meet the IDEA needs, as we talked about in the previous slides, for the students that they're serving. And that also may mean if we've got a group of students that we're not meeting their needs, that maybe we have to think about some different programming that we will provide at the local level as part of our school program, so that students can have this experience as part of what they do in their IEP experience, our IEP process, in their regular education experience. They can have that. It is an overarching goal in Pennsylvania for all students. And as you saw in IDEA 2004, it is an outcome and a primary area that we have to look at for all students with disabilities. So we understand that this gets a little muddy and a little confusing, but we're hoping that by providing these tools for mapping what's happening at the local level, that you'll take the opportunity to do that. You may also take the opportunity to collaborate with your local transition coordinating councils or employment councils that are in your area to do some of this work and map out some of what's available. And additionally, the patent system is offering supports through our Transition Discoveries Initiative. We have this year, there are 10 schools who are participating in that. We hope to offer that to more schools in the future, but Transition Discoveries is another way of helping you take a look at what is available at your local level, how you can collaborate with agencies such as OVR, and take a look at what is available out there for students and where are the gaps, where do we need to develop things so that our students have what they need. I don't know if Hillary or Caitlin, if you'd like to add anything.
Thank you, Jackie.
Hey, thank you. So again, this resource document is on the, I'm just going to go to the last part. It is on the patent website as one of your handouts. You can find it actually in a couple different places with the resource documents for today's webinar. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move into our next section for today's discussion. And what we're looking at in this next discussion is the kind of so what. So we looked at this crosswalk. We know that in general education and youth counseling services, we have the career ed and work standards actually starting way back in elementary school to support students and their outcomes regarding competitive integrated employment, career exploration. We have under WIOA, the pre-employment transition services, those 5 required areas, and then, moving into the transition services for eligible students. And then you have all the regulations around IDEA and transition services and activities starting at age 14, at least, in some places even before that. So you have all this, right? But the real question is, so what? So how does this impact, or what should youth and families know about this? So we have joining me now are Everett Dibler, and then we have Luz Hernandez and William Del Toro Vargas. So welcome, guys and gals. So we have a series of questions. Hey, and with the series of questions, we're just going to go ahead through, ask the question, and then you all can jump in and answer. So the first question, as a young person, when you were in school, or if in Luz's case as a family member, with your children in school and transitioning, were you aware that there was a direct connection between general education, special education, and OVR pre-eds? So Ev, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so it was funny. We did some preparation to answer your questions, and our response as a group was a hard no. And we thought, well, we have to come up with more of some of the answers than just saying heck no or no way. We didn't know. I think that, and with the youth and young adults that I work with now at the college level and different things, I will say, while the answer to that question is no, I do think that it is improving, but I think that's part of the reason why this document or these resources were created to supplement this MOU, was to help people understand this process, because the reality is that it's happening some places. Young people are making those connections, and in many cases they aren't able to see that, or families aren't able to see that. So the answer is a simple no, but I think that we're hopefully making progress where people are making those connections. But I do think families and the young adults, they are, their families and youth have trouble seeing the connection between the schools, OVR, and the agencies that will support them as an adult or as a young person in school. So it still is kind of hit or miss depending on where you live, I think.
Luz or William, any comments that you may have?
Well, Everett said it. We kind of came to that hard no. But with that being said, that is the importance of this crosswalk, right? That's why we're all here today, right? One of the importance is to be able to understand that, and this crosswalk provides that opportunity for families and educators to be able to work together and really look at what does this mean. So what is that correlation between general education, regular education, and OVR and or pre-ed services, and who's responsible for what, and how do we need to ensure that that comes together for the youth. And of course, just as important is for the youth to be as part of that crosswalk, right? So they should also understand that crosswalk. They should understand its implications and how general education, special education. I'm a true believer in, self-advocacy and being well informed from the beginning. So as a parent, when my son was transition age, I didn't understand that quite as well as this is broken out to be. So this is the blessings of something like this, is that from here on forward, we can use this as a tool, both from an educator standpoint, from a parent standpoint. They can take it to the schools and help them as well go through the process and explain it to them.
Well, then, Michael, I'll just jump in again before William might say something too. I think it's that a lot of the young adults we work with in Pennsylvania, with the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network, would say, I love that all these agencies and people are there, but I need to know why they're there and why do they only come in at certain points, or why are they here now and they weren't here before, or what is the process? So I think a lot of it is just helping people understand why people are where they are at certain points in the process with supporting someone and their family.
Great. And William, any other comments? Go ahead.
No, I think positive out of this MOU is since its inception, there has been more of a connection now between families and an understanding of what OER and special education does. I think that the OER and DSC have been pretty transparent on what their responsibilities are, and this MOU just puts it in writing and makes it clear cut that we want to make sure that our youth and family are informed and they have an understanding of what each of their responsibilities are.
And we really do take pride in the fact that this whole process and making all these resources that you're being shown have been looked at and vetted and supported by youth and young adults and families. So the stuff you see, we've been a part of, and it's been a really cool process to kind of have that real connection to what's being put out here today and through the other webinars.
Thanks. Well, let's look at question number 2. So question number 2 is, why is it important to understand the career ed and work standards, measurable annual goals and post-secondary school goals in education, and then the 5 required pre-employment transition services, but not just understanding them in high school, right? Beginning in elementary school and then continuing through high school. Why is it important for a young person, a family member, and actually the folks supporting them to know that this is this process, and that secondary transition is something that should be starting to be talked about in 2nd or 3rd grade?
Yeah, so
Go ahead, Luz.
Big question,
Okay,
I know. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, go
I'll
ahead,
start
Luz.
it off. So I think we alluded to this in the last question, right? So helping families understand that direct correlation between education and career ed at an early age is imperative. They need to start preparing their children early on through high school. Families should know that that the portfolio exists. What is the parameters of that portfolio? What are they looking at when they're looking at their child? What are the skills and goals they're working on? So that way, families working together with the educators, they can presume presume competence and have high expectations for their children early on, and that goes full across the border, right? So it's not only the families, it's also the educators. So it's really looking at, and I love the idea when Hillary discussed the portfolio a little bit more in detail about what that meant, starting at a 5th grade level and so on, is really looking at that. And I would encourage educators to bring parents on board and inform them of this so that they can take more ownership, if you will, and be able to continue that throughout school and home life, if you will. So, we always tend to think as parents, our kid is too young for that, 5th grade, 4th grade, whatever the case may be. They're too young to be worried about what they're going to do. I always tell people, I said, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up, okay? Because we evolve as we get older, right? I mean, from young to older, it isn't always as we planned it. But the idea is that at the end of the day, if we at the very minimum start them at a young age with just the ideologies, giving them and helping them explore and understand different things, that is what's going to get them further on in life, right? To reach their lifelong goals. So that's the importance of understanding career ed, work standards, looking at measurable annual goals, post-secondary school outcomes at a young age and into high school and beyond.
And Luz, I think part of that is really presuming competence and setting high expectations. That's what one of our programs at Families to the Max, TAN's Families to the Max, is all about. Presuming competence and setting high expectations so our students are prepared for the future.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, I'm sitting here laughing, listening to Luz answer this because
Mhm.
I actually told my parents about this, and I kind of asked the question, and I think I mentioned in a previous webinar that my life growing up was a vocational assessment because my mom was a fierce advocate who was a job trainer for many, many years. And so she pretty much connected things like this for me as a parent by luck. But I think families understanding this exists allows people to start things earlier and can kind of go down a pathway that kind of lights the path of what should be done when to help their young adult plan and think about their future and think about graduation earlier. We always say that we wish transition could start super early. And now, if people understand this, they realize that it can. And it does, like William said, truly allow people to set high expectations earlier, that the expectation is what their goal, what like their future can be seen sooner. So higher expectations can be set because a better plan can be made.
Thank you, guys. Going to move on to the third question. And the third question really gets at kind of this idea or concept that, we know it's really important, and from an education stance, that students achieve a high quality academic education and they obtain a diploma. And luckily in Pennsylvania, there is only one diploma that all students receive. But why is it also important for a student with a disability to participate in both pre-employment transition services and engage in IDEA transition services and activities, in addition to just doing the coursework to get that diploma?
William, you want to lead this one?
Yeah, go ahead. Your turn, bud.
All right. No. So one of the things that I'm laughing because we just went through this, like Ever said 2 days ago, and one of the things that we talked about was really preparing students for the future and allowing students to have allowing students to, set their own course and have a buy-in in their education. And really the conversation led us to, connecting their academic education with their transition activities and services, and how we can get students to be more interested in the academic portion of their education by merging both the transition activities with their academic education. Luce, you want to follow up?
Sure. I think looking at this as a whole, it's like providing students with the mapping tools, from awareness to employment opportunities or post-secondary outcomes, such as, career awareness, preparedness, acquisition, etc. These are things that really prepare a young adult, but we need to ensure that education meshes with that, right? And that they understand how that meshes together, because I think that's part of what we hear the youth many times discuss. It's like, what does math have to do with me? I'm not going to be a mathematician. I'm not going to be a nurse or whatever the case may have you. And many times they don't understand that correlation between academics and their future goals. We all know this, right? As educators, obviously, we know that all this transition into adult life, but we need to make that clearer for the students. And how does that work? You get a high school diploma. What does that mean? We don't want students to graduate to the couch. None of us do, right? We want students to graduate to whatever their lifelong goal is: independence, employment, and or post-secondary outcomes. So what are we looking at? How can we help them make that correlation between that? And why is education just as very important? Obviously, we all know, but how does pre-eds come into play, and where does that join to help them reach their maximum potential? I think those are the key things that we really have to look at when we work with students with and or without disabilities, quite honestly, and those who participate in the pre-eds program, looking at that as a whole as opposed to just a part of the picture.
So yeah, and I don't really have much to add, except, Michael, maybe I would say, how do you get academics to relate to what young adults really honestly care about, right? Lou said that, like, why am I doing math? What does it matter to me? Why am I doing this? Doesn't make any sense. A lot of young adults will literally break it down to, how am I going to make money? How do I socialize, and how do I gain independence? Right? So if they can't see how this is going to help them do those things, a lot of times for young adults doesn't make any sense, right? It's literally that simple. And sometimes when you say, well, it's just good for your education, well, that doesn't resonate a lot of times. So how can you break it down and make sure that what they're doing connects to them being able to eventually make money, have friends in a social life, and gain that independence that they see for themselves, whatever that may be. And I feel like transition and pre-ETS really helps to make those connections, but we have to be intentional about speaking their language and what they're really interested in getting to, which oftentimes is what we're all interested in getting to, which is making money, having the job and family that we want, and gaining some level of independence and being able to have fun at times.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And we have one final question for y'all. And this one is just kind of a wrap-up question. So what tips would you offer to youth and family members to understand this information that we talked about today? We know it's a bit overwhelming. It's kind of like, whoa, what is all this? But what do you think, or how do you think the professionals on today's call and the families, the advocates that are here could talk to families, talk to young folks about, hey, there's this great stuff that has now, been put together that could really help you in preparing for the future. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think, and I'll take this one first, because I guess we're going in order. I guess, I don't know.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, whatever.
That works.
To really help them understand there is this continuum that begins in elementary school is so important. I mean, to hear Hillary and Jackie and Caitlin really break this down, you really can see how this all interconnects. And the more people can understand that at a simple level, that things start at this time and this is what happens. And then it's almost like all of this, like the career ed and work standard stuff leads into transition, and it all interconnects. And if people can realize they can do this stuff earlier, you'll get more buy-in from youth and families. I mean, like I said, my mom would have loved to have known this stuff was there. She would have made me do things at home and try those different things. And maybe, and families are, I would say, with younger kids, taking that time, you really can do things to help them grow. So really helping them understand that continuum starts earlier is super, super important. And understanding how it will change throughout their lifespan. How you go from an entitlement system to an eligibility system is important too.
Absolutely. So, and thankfully, Everett, your mom was one of those strong advocates.
Yes,
right?
I'm very fortunate. I know that.
Yes, and well informed. Unfortunately, that's not the case for all families, right? Many families don't know their rights and their or their responsibilities. So I think it is on the onus of many times the educators to be able to help them through that process and explain it to them so that they can be able to move forward. So what would I recommend, or what would I offer as a tip to the families and or to the educators is for the families especially to ask, to learn these processes, like such as the crosswalk. Bring it to your schools if they don't have it. Insist and collaborate with your schools and OVR so that they can individualize the services for the youth to be able to succeed. So contact your schools, OVR, and community organizations such as CUNY, for more information and training opportunities so that you can be well informed and be able to advocate for your child and help them self-advocate as a youth and young adult.
Thank you. And William, any closing thoughts or comments?
I think I have two things. What tips would I offer youth? I think and family members. I think first for the youth is to really pay attention, and again echo what Lou said. Ask questions and make yourself present in your whole transition plan. It's all about you. And for families, make sure to push your youth, into those IEP meetings, into those conversations, even when they don't want to be. It's about them. It's for their future, and it's for their best. They're the ones making their choice for what they want to do after they graduate.
And the sooner they connect with all of that, the better. That's the sooner they understand what William just said, the better.
Great.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you, Luz and William and Evan, Really appreciate your thoughts and comments. And I think the point of kind of having the family youth perspective and discussion was that this discussion, this presentation today really is not at this higher level of just what's happening at the state. You know, we really wanted to emphasize this is something that should be being discussed and being incorporated at the local level and actually down to that individual youth and family level. So thank you guys, greatly appreciate it. And with that, we're going to switch gears slightly and move back to Hillary, Caitlin, and Jackie to talk about kind of the, okay, so what for professionals. So thinking about whether you're in education staff, a teacher, a transition coordinator, an administrator, or you work for OVR or you work for another agency, how does this impact you? So we're now going to move, and if Hillary and Jackie and Caitlin can join us, I'm going to start with a question for you all. So this first question is, how does the information discussed during today's webinar impact the day-to-day work of either an educator, a VR counselor, or an agency staff person? And somebody
I can start. I would honestly say I think it depends. I think it depends on what's already happening in your school district, at your local OVR office, and how willing you are to take some of the resources that were provided today and have those conversations together with everybody at the table. So yeah, that's going to be my answer. I think it depends.
I would add to it that I really think a lot of this starts with everybody's at different places in their experiences. But the idea of this memorandum of understanding is we know better, so let's do better. And let's take the opportunity to really let go of the things that have maybe not been successful in the past or our experiences that haven't worked, to really approach this moving forward with a positive and optimistic outlook that things can and will get better if the tools and the resources are used, and to really approach this because collaboration doesn't happen if we come with all of our baggage, right? If we come with all of our negative experiences and all of our predetermined decisions, we're not really approaching it with fidelity and an honest look that things are going to get better. So we have to come first and foremost to the table with the spirit of collaboration and the idea that we're going to work together, right? Together as one, to make this go better moving forward, to help impact outcomes for students. And I think one of the most important things is, if nothing else, taking the idea of what is our shared vision and goals, and how and what can we do individually and collectively to support that. At the end of the day, our goal and our job is to move students with disabilities into meaningful post-secondary experiences. And that's our goal for all students, but most specifically as a collective group for students with disabilities. So I think first come to the table ready to collaborate and use these tools and work through the process. It's going to take work. It's putting up elbow grease. It's taken a really long time for us to get to this point to be able to even present this to you. This has been almost 2 years in the making. So it takes time and effort, and it takes the willingness to sit at the table and work through some of the difficult conversations.
Jackie?
I would say, I agree with Hillary in that this is a messy process. We don't have it all figured out yet. Like Michael, I've been at this for a long time, and to me, this is one of the most exciting things that I've had the opportunity to be a part of, because I do see it as something that is inherently positive as we bring together stakeholders and begin to make a difference for this process of moving towards positive outcomes for our students. I find that personally in my day-to-day work, I find that exciting. And I hope you'll join along with that too. And as Hillary said, maybe let go of some of the things that have happened in the past, because again, like Michael, I've seen it all and I've been a part of it all. But I think I do see this as a very manageable and positive step forward.
Just to reinforce that, like Hillary said, it's taken us a couple of 2 years here to get to this point. So we don't expect, everything to be worked out in the next 2 months and ready to start next school year. It's definitely a long collaborative process. So any small steps forward, I think, are great achievements.
And I would also just say, we've tried to model the inclusion of youth and families as part of this process. And if anything else, I think that's the other big takeaway for our teams, is to really start to think about, why don't we have youth or family at the table? What can we do? How can we start the conversations earlier? I think Luce mentioned the whole idea of presuming competence and why is this important for youth and families. At the end of the day, this is important because every decision that we make as an IEP team, as a transition team, from the moment a student qualifies for special education, has a direct impact on the potential post-secondary outcomes for that student. So knowing this earlier, bringing people to the table, making sure youth, families, and stakeholders have the information they need to be informed members of the team, and making sure that their voice is heard, not just bringing them to the table, but listening to their input as well. So to me, that's how it impacts day-to-day work.
Thank you, guys. Move on to the next question. And the next question is, how do you partner to be aware, use this information to supplement and not supplant? We've heard those two words throughout this morning, services and activities, and to keep students at the center of the transition process. And you all kind of alluded to the last conversation we were having, but what are your thoughts?
I think, part of it goes back to really looking at that basic definition of transition in IDEA and looking at what it is that is required by that law, so that these transition services are required by that law. And then in our last webinar, we talked about a few other laws that support that and bring the work of OVR and other agencies around that experience. So when we're looking at that planning, you've got to have those voices at the table. As Hillary mentioned just a minute ago, and as we talked about all along, I think Melissa mentioned that too, you've got to have all those voices at the table. And if you're missing a voice, you're going to miss something. So I think if we don't, that is the process that we need to be paying attention to, is having people at the table talking with one another and not leaning back on, well, OVR never did this before, or in my school district, this is what we do. We've got to be opening up and taking a look and thinking about that in a different way, and keeping at the center of that, what are the needs of students?
I would, bring on to that too, that the whole idea really is to be thinking about all of these things in collaboration and not in isolation, and how much more information that we can acquire to help a student make decisions for themselves and to help families understand the decision-making process if we bring all of those pieces together to the table. If we exclude things that are happening in the regular education setting, we are, through the career education and work standards, through that career plan, and we don't make those interconnections to those experiences, we are leaving out huge pieces of information about students. And beyond that, from a programming standpoint, if we're not considering the things that we are exposing students to in the general education setting, as well as what we're doing in IDEA, I'm not sure how we can even start to identify where our gaps are to be able to approach the table with OVR and say, these are the things that our students aren't experiencing that we need to collaborate with you, that we need to partner with you for. So by understanding how these things relate and what we're doing at the local level, that's the way that we start to fill the gaps with what OVR can bring to the table, to supplement, not supplant.
And I had mentioned earlier that our crosswalk was what we came up with to have that supplement and not supplant, because we couldn't have a black and white list of what services are is the school responsible and OVR responsible for. And I think that's because if we're keeping the student at the center of the process, every student is individual in what they need to be supported to reach, hopefully their end job goal. So the services are going to change for each individual student that we're looking at. So that is why we can't have that, straight list of, who's responsible for what, because it truly does change depending on the student that we are talking about.
Great, thank you. And I think one of the other points that I heard, and Hillary, I think you've mentioned this, but you need to think about where you're at locally and start there. This discussion is like a master's course in transition. It's definitely not the basics. So I think you all really need to kind of look at where are you locally, either in education or in VR, and your connections and collaborations, and then start from there to build upon it. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, listening to some of your answers. The next question, is it okay that the flow of services and resource mapping doesn't look the same everywhere in Pennsylvania, which is kind of a lead into my last comment. So if someone wants to jump in.
I would say we didn't even have to have a pre-discussion about this, but similar to how Everett, Luce, and William had a overwhelming no for one of their questions, we have an overwhelming yes. It is okay for this question, right? We've kind of talked throughout that everybody has different funding, everybody has different resources, every community looks a little bit different, and it's not the same across the state. So those decisions really are local collaborative decisions and based on the resources that are available within the area.
I would say some of what I've heard over the years of doing this is that, oh, well, in Pittsburgh, they have this, and in Philly, they have that. And they have, oh, look, they have Project Search here, but we don't have Project Search. And so I think some of this process is to begin to put that out in the open and say, yeah, that's true. That is happening, but let's ask the questions and see if there is something in this area. So we look at our resources and we look at what our students need. What is it that we can bring to the table? So it is not going to look identical across the state of Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is a large state and it's very different from end to end. And what students need from end to end is very different. So that is why it absolutely must be different.
Yeah. And Jackie, I think, the easiest way to figure that out and answer that question is the communication between everybody. It's between the school, between OVR, between any other outside agency, between the student and the family. Like, that's how we're going to figure out, what is available for that student in that area. So yes, it's okay to look different.
All righty. And the last question for y'all. You may have heard about Transition Discoveries, right? It's a project. It started probably about 4 or 5 years ago. It has evolved. It's really this process that was kind of a grassroots, engaging with youth and families. It's being led by staff from the George Washington University. So a lot of folks may be aware of this, but I guess the question is, one, about Transition Discoveries, how do you feel this could be used as a strategy to prioritize and improve services and outcomes for students with disabilities?
I think one of the strongest things about Transition Discoveries at the outset is the survey that is available to be administered to youth, to families, and all transition stakeholders, because we can sit and hypothesize as leaders or as a teacher or as an OVR counselor that we know what the problem is, but until we actually survey our stakeholders and get a sense as to what is and isn't working in our communities, because that's the other thing. Transition Discoveries is a strengths as well as a let's identify priority areas approach. So by utilizing survey data to really get a sense as to what strengths and gaps do we have, and then the other part of it being using that data to bring a team together, a cross-agency team, community action-based planning, to really start to identify priority areas to move the needle a little bit at a time to improving overall transition planning.
And I think, one of the strengths that we see and really attracts us to Transition Discoveries as a way of building what's happening at the LEA level to better support transition outcomes is that the voices of youth and family are in the forefront of what's happening in those discussions. So as teams are coming together, as these teams are coming together and creating action plans, it's really a level playing field for everybody. When maybe previously what we've seen is at the district level or at a local school level, they'll say, here are our programs, pick one from column A. Rather, Transition Discoveries takes a look at what is already happening and then says, but what do we need? Let's dream and figure out what we need. And all the voices at the table have an equal voice. So we really believe that Transition Discoveries is that tool across Pennsylvania that will really help us be able to bring those voices to the forefront so that everybody's hearing what is needed.
And they do have a nice, wonderful new website. So if you haven't checked it out yet, definitely do so.
And I just put the link in there. It is transitiondiscovery.org. If you want more information, there's a ton of resources, wonderful videos, and it is something that through the intermediate unit and patent system, they're working with pilots throughout the state. And I know OVR, Caitlin is actively involved with that too. So again, thank you. Alrighty, thank you guys. Appreciate your conversations, and we have another poll. All right, so you have heard over not just today, but the last two webinars, if you've been able to join us, you've been involved in these discussions, and you kind of are hearing about, you know, this new re-emphasized emphasis on collaboration around secondary transition in the state. So what we would like to do now, and let me pull it up, is launch this poll on how optimistic are you regarding what you've been hearing. So how optimistic are you that the MOU and supporting resources presented in this webinar series will have a positive impact on your day-to-day work and will improve successful outcomes for students with disabilities? You know, and going back, as folks are answering, you know, in some places in the state, a lot of this discussion, these things have been happening. You know, you have really robust local transition coordinating councils. You have school districts with real active transition coordinators connected to their VR counselors. There's a lot of interagency collaboration, but not in every, you know, part of the state. So we'll give folks a few more minutes to vote. We're at about 60%. So, you know, please go ahead and add your thoughts in, you know, as we collaborate, because I think that's the other part of this. There needs to be buy-in. There needs to be investment in, you know, what are the resources and how can we locally do this? How can you collaborate? How can you engage locally in this process? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and we'll end the poll and give folks some view as far as what folks think. So I am very hopeful that more than half of you that are participating are very optimistic. With some folks at 7% extremely, and then some folks saying somewhat. I'm happy that folks don't feel this is just a bunch of bunk and it's not going to happen, or are doubtful. So that it really is encouraging, and it's encouraging that the folks that are participating today really feel that this could have a positive impact in supporting students, youth, young adults with disabilities across the Commonwealth. So thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. And with that, we are going to move on for some time for you to chat. So what we'd like you to do into the chat box is put in there, what is one thing that you will be doing differently tomorrow as a result of the information you heard today, or perhaps from all the 3 webinars in this series. So go ahead, if you could type those in, and then I will ask Jackie, Hillary, and Caitlin to kind of look at some of those comments and you know, give us some feedback. So please go ahead and type into chat, what is one thing that you will do differently tomorrow?
I'm seeing a lot about listening and engaging families more. So that's exciting.
Oh, I see using this to start the conversations earlier at the elementary level and increasing collaborative work.
And even some encouraging that folks are on the right path.
Working on flow of services.
Sharing the resources, good idea.
Doing the mapping.
Involving OVR earlier.
Working with the local transition coordinating council to do some local mapping.
Yeah, student-led IEPs, great idea.
Yeah. Yeah, again, and another one, encouraging the student to be more active in the IEP.
Somebody's already doing work. They already set up after the last webinar.
I see some more outreach to families, which
Yeah,
is
using the
critical.
crosswalk. Mhm.
Mhm.
And I think, and I know Hillary, Jackie, and Caitlin did talk about this, but this is not an easy process. It is involved, and even with the mapping, and not only just with Pennsylvania, but Melissa and I were working with another state, and they were doing some pilots, and they were talking about the time and just how long it takes to really do that and how it's an evolving process. And I think that you recognize that, and as you're struggling and you feel like this is taking time, know that yes, it's hard work, right? But it is well worth it. You know, to reiterate, even with this webinar series, this has been 2 years in the making. When we sat down, I can still remember we were in this little room figuring out, okay, we got to get this MOU and this agreement together and implement this. How's this going to happen? And it took a lot of time. So just to restate that, as you start embarking, regardless of whether, and I saw a couple of comments that someone was at a school that has none of this stuff happening, to kind of the folks in the doctoral transition world that are doing this stuff locally that have it kind of figured out, think about where you are and then as you build. So I just wanted to kind of make that observation.
And I would say too, this work isn't done yet. We're not done bringing information to you and resources to you. This is going to be an ongoing collaboration. You'll, whether you like it or not, maybe see our faces a lot as we move forward, because this work is not done and we still have lots of work to do. This work will continue. And so we hope that you continue to be patient, that you leverage some of the resources our intermediate unit TAC and the local VR counselors, as well as the VR supervisors, and then the 3 transition specialists, Caitlin, Melissa, and Beth Ann, are all great resources. So if you're having problems getting started, as well as your patent system, reach out, get support. Don't do this in isolation. We're here to help. And that's really the message that I hope everybody takes away, is that we're giving you the tools, but we're not saying do it and we're never going to help you. Do it and ask for help when you need help.
And also, I guess to just reiterate, your intermediate unit transition folks and your folks in your school district, you know, you have a lot of resources in Pennsylvania that is very unique to what's happening in a lot of other states. So really kind of take advantage of that. And we have another participant dialogue question. So hang on one second, let me pull it up. And this kind of gets at what Hillary was just talking about. This is the 3rd in this webinar series, but this is really the start of this process. We had mentioned from the first webinar when we heard from Carol Clancy, the director of the Bureau of Special Education, and Shannon Austin, the director of the Rehabilitation Rehabilitation, that part of this is pulling together a toolkit. We have resources, and we are just embarking on this. You know, it's like the first chapter of the toolkit is being filled. There's much more to come. So with that in mind, and in the chat box, could you put in there, in thinking about all this, what additional information and or resources would you feel would really be helpful to you, your work, either your work directly as a professional in education or VR or one of the other agency partners from IDDD or mental health, behavioral health, or community rehab provider, or as a family member, or as a young person, what else? You know, because we are going to take this information as the work group that has been involved with this and really sit down and look at, okay, so now what? You know, where are we moving next? What will really help you all in doing your work? So if you could go ahead and take a minute into the chat, type in what you feel would really be helpful or what considerations would be helpful. And with that, I'm going to ask Jackie, Hillary, and Caitlin to let us know what folks are saying.
Sure. First, we want to recognize folks are saying, Luz, that the chat, that the link you shared is not working. So we'll get that out to you in a different way. And yes, these recordings are being archived.
Continued opportunities for collaboration and resources, finding ways to get reps at the table, time. If we could turn back time, right? I feel like Cher. It's always, if time and money are always problems, but I think we have to get creative in how we think about time and money and what collaboration looks like. And I think if anything, this year has shown us that collaboration can look really different and unique. We started this process sitting at a table in a really small room and finished it with bi-weekly meetings on a Zoom and sometimes work groups. So it's definitely been an evolving process.
I saw transportation pop up a couple times. I think that's always at the center of almost every discussion when it comes to barriers. So
We're seeing some comments about more specific support around working with students with more complex needs.
oh,
And
and
Luz,
go ahead.
say Luz did post another link if others want to try that.
Reducing an IEP from 33 pages to 10. I wish we could help with that because I've seen 90-page ones and that's overwhelming. Yes.
Yeah, related service providers are saying, how can they better support this? It's great to hear.
Training for teachers. So some of what it will be coming is kind of like some agency 101s. That's definitely on the table. So for teachers to understand who OVR is and what they bring, but the same thing for counselors to understand what are the educational requirements. That's definitely on the table for next year.
Now, I'm looking at other information about mapping. Recognize that that mapping tool is something you can take and do at your in your local area, not something that would be prepared for you, but something you take and do.
So involving students and parents in these trainings and discussions, which, you know, hopefully, again, it's some of the resources shared today were developed by our parents and our youth. So, you know, continuing to do that.
So Michael mentioned we take these ideas and we will be meeting back as a larger group and thinking about what do we need to do to meet the needs of the field based on the things you're putting in here. So we will certainly be taking a look at all of these more comprehensively and developing a plan of action.
Great. Well, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and move on as we up. But thank you for your comments and thanks to Hillary, Jackie, and Caitlin. And with that, Hillary, bring us home.
Great. So some concluding thoughts are there are some upcoming events that might be of interest to you. One is on June 2nd. Peel will be sponsoring a cross-agency collaboration session with leaders from ODP, OVR, and the Bureau of Special Education to talk about how we're branching out our collaboration to ODP as well. And how the different partners all work together. So we don't have registration or any information for that yet, but be on the lookout. We will post that and share that out through our communities, through our intermediate unit TAC, and through our partners as well. And then in addition, HUNE is sponsoring the first Spanish Transition to Graduation Conference on July 13th. So be on the lookout. I think Luz posted some information and we'll get that other information if the link didn't work for you. We recognize that our VR partners and our PA.gov partners can't access Google Docs. Okay, next slide. And again, I just want to remind you that we will be holding the Pennsylvania Community on Transition virtual conference over August 11th and 12th, Navigating the Future, a Lifetime Trip. It is a free conference this year. We do encourage transition stakeholders, including and most importantly, youth and families, to come to the conference. Look for registration within the next week. It's getting posted soon. We're just finalizing the conference brochure. And once that's done, so within a week, you should have information about how to register. But we really strongly encourage the learning to continue. And there will be some updated information about this MOU work shared at the conference as well, including plans for next year and the hopeful unveiling of our new website to support the work that we do in secondary transition in Pennsylvania. And thank you to everybody who participated today. Jackie just put a link to the evaluation in the chat. This must be completed in order to receive credit for attendance at today's webinar for Act 48. CRCC and the other credits through the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. Please, please, please make sure you fill that out because once it closes, we cannot reopen it. When you click on that link, it'll tell you when the form is going to close. So please pay attention to that because as I mentioned, you have to get it in and filled out in order to receive your credit for attending today. We are so excited about the work that we're doing with our partners. It has really, truly been the motto of It Takes a Village. These are just the partners that have been at the table for this series this year. And as I mentioned, the work will continue. You're going to be seeing our faces and hearing our voices. And we hope that you continue to join us, to share these resources, to make it happening at the local level, and that you reach out for support as you go through this process if it becomes overwhelming or you need that support. So thank you, everybody, for attending today. And I think I finished with 1 minute to spare. Great. Everybody have a wonderful afternoon today. Hopefully you have a little bit of sunshine. We're starting in Pittsburgh with some sunshine, which is nice. Thank you and have a wonderful day.